Sometimes the quietest moment in a room tells you everything about the people inside it. The grocery store in Cedar Ridge was small, the kind of place where the bell above the door chimed like a polite hello every time someone stepped in. And on that cold Thursday evening, the fluorescent lights hummed softly above narrow aisles of canned soup and cereal boxes, while the wind outside dragged dry leaves across the parking lot like whispers on asphalt. And near the checkout counter, a young woman in a faded army jacket stood with two little girls clinging gently to her sides as if they were afraid the world might pull them apart. Emily Carter looked like someone who had carried too many miles on her shoulders, her blonde hair tied back loosely, her eyes tired but steady, the quiet eyes of a soldier who had seen more than most people in town ever would. And beside her, the twin girls, Lily and Ava, no more than 7 years old, held a single gallon of milk between them like it was something precious, something fragile. "That's all you're getting?" the cashier asked flatly. Emily gave a small nod and emptied the change from her pocket onto the counter, the coins clicking against the plastic tray like tiny echoes in the room. Quarters, dimes, nickels. Not quite enough. The line behind her shifted. Someone sighed loudly. A man further back muttered something about people needing to plan better. The girls looked down at their sneakers, worn and scuffed from playground gravel. Emily counted the coins again, slower this time, her fingers careful, disciplined, like someone trained to stay calm under pressure. "Ma'am," the cashier said gently but firmly, "you're still short $2. For a moment the room felt still, the kind of stillness that settles before a storm or before someone says something they might regret. Emily inhaled quietly and slid 2 quarters back into her pocket. "That's okay," she said softly. "Girls, we'll just take the bread tonight." Lily's small hand tightened around the milk jug as if she understood exactly what was happening, and Ava's eyes flicked toward the door where the wind rattled the glass like it was impatient for them to leave. 3 people behind them, someone chuckled under his breath. Not cruel exactly, just careless in the way people sometimes are when hardship belongs to someone else. And that was the moment Daniel Harper noticed them. Daniel had been standing near the back of the line holding a bag of dog food and a frozen pizza, the ordinary groceries of a quiet Thursday evening, his denim jacket dusted with sawdust from the carpentry shop, where he worked 10 hours a day. But when he heard the coins on the counter and saw the girls' faces, something inside him shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just the way a door opens slowly when the wind finds it. He stepped forward. "Add the milk," he said calmly, setting a $20 bill on the counter. The cashier blinked. Emily turned slightly, surprised. "You don't have to. Kids should go home with milk," Daniel replied simply, his voice steady and quiet like someone who didn't need attention for doing the right thing. The girls looked up at him with cautious curiosity, the way children study strangers who suddenly become part of their story. Emily hesitated for a moment, pride and gratitude passing across her face like clouds over sunlight. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice soft but sincere. Daniel just nodded once and picked up his bag. Outside, the wind had grown colder, the sky dimming toward evening, and as Emily walked out holding the milk while the twins skipped beside her, she had no idea that the quiet man who had just helped her was about to change the course of her life. And Daniel Harper had absolutely no idea that the small kindness he offered that night would soon bring something to Cedar Ridge that the entire town would never forget. The wind outside Cedar Ridge carried the smell of pine and cold pavement as Emily Carter stepped out of the grocery store with Lily and Ava walking close beside her, the gallon of milk tucked carefully under her arm as though it were something fragile and important. And for a moment she paused under the yellow glow of the parking lot light while the girls adjusted their small backpacks that looked too big for their narrow shoulders. "Mom, that man was nice," Lily said quietly, her voice soft but certain. Ava nodded beside her. "People do not usually help like that." Emily glanced back toward the store window where Daniel Harper was now paying for his groceries, his posture calm and unremarkable, just another man finishing a long day. And yet something about the moment lingered in her mind the way distant thunder lingers after a storm. "Sometimes people surprise you," she said gently, though her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned not to expect too much from the world. The girls climbed into the old pickup truck that had clearly seen many miles, its faded blue paint dull beneath the streetlight, and Emily started the engine while the heater rattled awake like an old friend clearing its throat. As she drove down the quiet two-lane road toward the small rental house on the edge of town, the twins talked softly in the back seat about school and a spelling test coming up on Friday, their voices light and hopeful in the way children manage even when life is uncertain. But Emily's thoughts stayed on the moment inside the store. Back in Cedar Ridge, kindness was not rare, but quiet kindness without questions had become something she had almost forgotten. Meanwhile, Daniel Harper stepped out of the grocery store carrying his single paper bag and paused when the cold evening air brushed against his face, the town street quiet except for the distant hum of a passing pickup truck. He noticed the same old blue truck pulling away slowly, and for a moment, he watched the red taillights fade into the dark road beyond the parking lot. The cashier from inside leaned through the doorway holding the door open while stacking empty baskets. "You know her?" she asked casually. Daniel shook his head once. "No, ma'am." She shrugged lightly. "Army veteran, I think. Moved here a few months ago. People say she keeps to herself." Daniel nodded again, not asking more questions, because he was the kind of man who understood that stories often carried more weight than strangers deserved to hear. He walked toward his own pickup truck parked under the old oak tree at the edge of the lot, the gravel crunching under his boots while the wind rustled the branches above him like quiet applause. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town where everyone eventually noticed everyone else, where a small moment could travel through the community like ripples across a still lake. But Daniel Harper had not stepped forward in the grocery store for attention or recognition. He had stepped forward because sometimes the simplest thing in the world was also the most important. Back on the narrow county road, Emily slowed the truck near a railroad crossing while the twins pressed their foreheads against the glass, watching the empty tracks stretching into the distance. Ava spoke first, her voice thoughtful. "Mom, do you think that man has kids?" Emily hesitated for a second before answering. Her eyes focused on the dark road ahead, illuminated only by the truck headlights. "Maybe," she said quietly. "Maybe he understands what it is like." The truck rolled forward again, disappearing deeper into the quiet countryside of Cedar Ridge, and none of them realized that the small act of kindness from a stranger that night was already beginning to shift something unseen in the quiet rhythm of the town. Morning arrived slowly over Cedar Ridge, the pale winter sun rising behind rows of quiet houses, while frost clung to fences and mailboxes like delicate glass. Emily Carter woke before the alarm, the habit of early mornings still stitched deep into her bones after years of military discipline, and she sat for a moment at the small kitchen table of the rented house, while the coffee maker hummed softly beside her. The house itself was modest, barely 900 square feet, with creaking floorboards and thin walls that carried every sound. But it was warm and safe, and for now that was enough. From the hallway came the soft footsteps of Lily and Ava padding toward the kitchen in oversized socks. "Good morning, Mom," Lily said sleepily. Ava followed with a small yawn. Emily smiled faintly and poured warm oatmeal into 2 bowls while the twins climbed into their chairs, the rising steam curling in the quiet kitchen air. Outside, the wind brushed across the fields beyond town, carrying the distant whistle of a freight train rolling through the valley. "Are we walking today?" Ava asked between bites. "Yes," Emily answered gently. "It is only half a mile to the school bus stop." The girls nodded without complaint because children often accept the shape of their lives more easily than adults do. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel Harper was already at the carpentry shop, the scent of fresh-cut pine filling the long wooden building while sunlight spilled through the dusty windows in narrow golden beams. He moved calmly between work tables, measuring boards and sanding edges with the quiet focus of someone who had spent years building things with patience and steady hands. His coworker Mike leaned against the doorway sipping coffee from a paper cup. "You see that army woman in the grocery store last night?" he asked casually. Daniel looked up briefly but did not stop working. "Yes." Mike shrugged. "Town says she moved here after her husband died, raising those twin girls alone." Daniel nodded once, but said nothing more. He had learned long ago that stories about people often carried more assumptions than truth. Back at the small house, Emily zipped the twins into their winter coats before stepping outside, where the morning air bit sharply at their cheeks. The gravel road stretched quietly toward the highway while a few distant trucks rumbled past heading toward neighboring towns. As they walked the half-mile path toward the bus stop, the girls talked about a science project due next week, their voices bright against the cold air. Emily listened while scanning the quiet road out of habit, not from fear, but from a sense of responsibility that never truly fades in those who once served. When the yellow school bus finally appeared over the hill, the twins climbed aboard and waved through the window, while Emily stood on the roadside watching until the bus disappeared around the bend. For a moment she remained there alone in the quiet morning, the wind brushing her jacket and the distant mountains rising pale against the sky. Across Cedar Ridge, Daniel finished stacking a row of wooden frames and wiped sawdust from his hands before stepping outside the shop for a breath of fresh air. From where he stood, he could see the long county road stretching toward the far fields and the faint outline of a woman walking back from the bus stop with steady, determined steps. He recognized the same faded army jacket moving through the cold sunlight. He did not call out. He did not wave. He simply watched for a moment with thoughtful eyes before returning to his workbench, unaware that the quiet intersection of their lives had only just begun. Late afternoon settled gently over Cedar Ridge as the sun dipped lower behind the quiet hills, casting long amber shadows across the narrow streets and small wooden houses that made up the heart of the town. Inside the carpentry shop, Daniel Harper finished wiping down his workbench while the scent of pine and varnish lingered in the warm air. The day had been long but steady, the kind of honest work that left his hands tired and his mind quiet. Mike leaned against the doorway again, folding his arms while watching Daniel stack the last of the wooden frames. "You heading home already?" he asked. Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes." Mike hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Town meeting tonight at the church hall. Something about helping new families settle in." Daniel paused briefly but did not answer right away. Outside the large shop window, he could see the road stretching toward the edge of town where the smaller rental houses stood near the fields. Somewhere out there, Emily Carter was probably finishing another long day of trying to build a life from very little. Daniel picked up his jacket calmly. "Maybe I will stop by later," he said. Meanwhile, on the far side of Cedar Ridge, Emily stood at the small kitchen sink of her rented house, washing the last of the dinner dishes, while Lily and Ava sat at the table coloring pictures with worn crayons spread across old worksheets from school. The kitchen light buzzed softly above them, and through the thin window, she could see the fading orange sky stretching across the quiet farmland beyond the backyard fence. "Mom," Ava said suddenly while holding up her drawing, "do you think we can plant flowers here in the spring?" Emily looked at the small patch of dirt outside the window where winter grass had turned pale and brittle. For a moment she imagined what the yard might look like with bright colors growing there. "Maybe," she answered gently. Lily leaned over the table, studying the drawing. "We could plant sunflowers. They grow really tall." Emily smiled faintly at the thought, but behind the quiet warmth of the moment, another worry lingered in her mind. The rent on the house was due again soon, and although she worked part-time cleaning the local community center, the hours were never guaranteed. She dried her hands slowly on a small kitchen towel and glanced at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. The numbers felt heavier than they should. Later that evening, the air grew cooler as the town lights flickered on one by one along the main street. The small church hall near the center of Cedar Ridge filled gradually, with residents arriving for the weekly community meeting. Wooden folding chairs scraped softly across the floor as neighbors greeted each other with familiar nods and quiet conversation. Daniel stepped through the doorway quietly, removing his cap as he scanned the room. He was not a man who spoke much at meetings, but he believed in showing up. Across the hall near the back row, Emily Carter entered slowly, still wearing the same faded army jacket she had worn earlier that week. The twins followed closely behind her, their small hands holding each other as they stepped into the unfamiliar crowd. For a moment, Emily hesitated, unsure if she truly belonged in a room full of strangers discussing community projects and neighborhood improvements. Then Lily tugged gently on her sleeve. "Mom, look," she whispered. Emily followed her daughter's gaze across the hall and saw Daniel Harper sitting quietly near the center row. He noticed them at the same moment. For a second, neither of them spoke. Daniel simply gave a small, respectful nod, the kind that carried no expectation and no pressure. Emily returned the nod with a faint smile before guiding the twins toward the empty seats nearby. And in that quiet room filled with ordinary conversation and the soft creak of folding chairs, something subtle shifted again in the quiet rhythm of Cedar Ridge, as though the town itself was slowly beginning to notice the quiet threads tying these lives together. The meeting in the small church hall continued with the slow rhythm of a town that had known each other for years. Neighbors discussing road repairs, school fundraisers, and the upcoming spring fair, while the soft hum of conversation filled the wooden room. Emily Carter sat quietly near the back with Lily and Ava beside her, the twins whispering to each other while swinging their feet above the floor. Emily listened politely but spoke very little, the habit of observation still guiding her the way it had during years in uniform. Across the room, Daniel Harper remained in his chair with the calm posture of someone who never felt the need to take center stage, his hands resting loosely on his knees while he listened to the discussion about helping families who had recently moved into Cedar Ridge. Finally, the town council volunteer stood and cleared her throat. "We all know our town has always looked after one another," she said warmly. "If anyone here needs support with housing repairs, childcare, or finding work, this is the time to speak up." For a brief moment, the room grew quiet. Emily lowered her gaze toward the floor because asking for help had never been easy for her, even when it was needed. Lily gently tugged her sleeve. "Mom," she whispered softly, "maybe they can help us fix the heater." Emily hesitated, feeling the familiar tension between pride and responsibility. The heater in their small rental house worked only half the time, and the coming winter nights were already growing colder. Before she could say anything, a man from across the room spoke quietly. "The Carter house on Maple Road has an old furnace. It probably just needs new wiring." Emily looked up and saw Daniel Harper standing slowly from his chair. The room turned toward him. He did not speak loudly, but his voice carried the steady calm of someone used to solving problems rather than talking about them. "I can take a look tomorrow evening," he said simply. The volunteer smiled with relief. "That would be wonderful, Daniel." Emily felt the attention shift toward her, and she stood as well, her posture straight but respectful. "I appreciate that," she said. "I can pay for the parts once I get my next paycheck." Daniel shook his head slightly, not dismissing her dignity, but refusing the weight of the moment. "We will just see what it needs first," he answered calmly. The meeting moved on to other topics, but something quiet had already changed in the room. People began glancing toward Emily with less uncertainty and more curiosity, as if the presence of Daniel Harper beside her somehow reassured them that she belonged here after all. When the meeting finally ended, neighbors gathered near the door pulling on coats and exchanging small talk, while the cold night air drifted in each time the door opened. Lily and Ava stood beside their mother watching the town slowly empty out. Daniel approached them with the same quiet manner he carried everywhere. "The house on Maple Road is the small white one near the fence line, correct?" he asked. Emily nodded. "Yes, that is the one." Ava looked up at him with bright curiosity. "Do you fix heaters?" she asked. Daniel gave a faint smile. "Sometimes." Lily glanced at her sister before adding, "Seriously, our heater makes a loud clanking noise at night." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, as if this information mattered. "That is helpful to know." Emily watched the exchange carefully, noticing how easily the twins had begun speaking to him without fear. Outside the church hall, the night sky stretched wide and clear above Cedar Ridge, the stars sharp and bright against the cold air. As Daniel walked toward his truck, he paused briefly and looked back at the small family standing under the porch light. For reasons he could not yet explain, the quiet promise he had made about fixing the heater felt like the beginning of something larger than a simple repair. And somewhere deep in the quiet rhythm of the town, the first threads of that change were already beginning to weave themselves together. The next evening, the air over Cedar Ridge carried the sharp smell of winter grass and wood smoke drifting from chimneys as Daniel Harper turned his pickup truck on a Maple Road just as the last of the daylight slipped behind the low hills beyond town. The small white rental house stood quietly near the fence line, exactly where Emily Carter had said it would be, its porch light glowing softly against the growing dusk, while a narrow gravel driveway crunched under Daniel's tires as he pulled in. For a moment he sat behind the steering wheel listening to the engine tick as it cooled, the kind of small pause a man takes before stepping into someone else's life. Through the front window, he could see the warm glow of the kitchen light and the shadows of two small figures moving around inside. Then the front door opened and Lily and Ava burst onto the porch with the unfiltered excitement only children seem to carry without hesitation. "He is here," Lily announced breathlessly as if the entire evening depended on that single moment. Emily followed them out a second later, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear while offering a polite but sincere smile. "Thank you for coming," she said. Daniel nodded once and stepped out of the truck, the cold evening air brushing against his jacket. "You said the heater was making noise at night," he replied calmly. Ava nodded quickly. "It sounds like a metal bucket rolling down the stairs." Daniel allowed the faintest hint of amusement to cross his face before walking toward the house. Inside the small living room, the air felt cooler than it should for late November, the kind of quiet chill that slowly settles into the corners of a house when the furnace struggles to keep up. The heater itself sat behind a narrow utility door near the hallway, and Daniel knelt down to open the panel while the twins watched with wide curiosity from the doorway. Emily stood a few feet behind them with her arms folded lightly, not from defensiveness, but from the habit of someone who had spent years waiting patiently while problems were solved step by step. The heater clicked once and rattled softly as Daniel examined the wiring and the small motor inside the unit. For several minutes the room stayed quiet except for the faint hum of the furnace fan and the distant sound of a car passing on the highway beyond the fields. Finally, Daniel reached for a screwdriver from his toolbox and adjusted a loose connection before tightening two small bolts along the side panel. The heater responded with a steady low hum, the uneven clanking noise fading almost immediately. Lily looked at Ava with wide eyes. "It stopped," she whispered. Ava stepped closer to the door and listened carefully as warm air began to flow through the vent near the floor. Emily exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing as if someone had quietly lifted a weight she had been carrying for weeks. "How much do I owe you?" she asked after a moment. Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth and stood up. "Nothing," he said simply. Emily hesitated because pride does not disappear easily, even when gratitude is stronger. "At least let me pay for the parts," she insisted gently. Daniel shook his head again, not dismissing her, but answering with the same quiet certainty that had defined every moment she had seen from him so far. "There were no parts," he said, "just a loose connection." The twins exchanged relieved smiles before Lily suddenly asked the question that had been waiting in their minds since the grocery store. "Do you fix other things too?" Daniel looked at them for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he said. Emily watched the small exchange unfold beneath the warm light of the living room lamp, and for the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, she felt something unfamiliar settling quietly in her chest. It was not certainty, and it was not relief exactly. It was something quieter than that, the beginning of trust. The warmth from the repaired heater slowly filled the small house on Maple Road that evening, the gentle flow of air through the vents carrying with it a quiet comfort that had been missing for weeks, and Lily and Ava sat cross-legged on the living room rug watching the floor vent, as if the steady hum of warm air were some small miracle that had arrived without warning. Emily Carter stood near the kitchen doorway with her arms folded lightly, watching Daniel Harper close his toolbox with the calm efficiency of someone who never lingered longer than necessary. "It should stay steady now," he said simply, brushing a bit of dust from his jacket sleeve. Emily nodded with sincere gratitude. "You have no idea how much that helps." The twins looked up at him again with the kind of admiration children reserve for people who solve problems adults cannot fix alone. Lily spoke first. "Do you live far away?" Daniel shook his head slightly. "Just across town, near the old oak trees." Ava leaned forward with curiosity. "Do you have kids?" The question hung gently in the warm room for a moment. Daniel paused before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. "I have a daughter." Emily noticed the slight change in his voice, not sadness exactly, but something thoughtful and distant, the way memories sometimes shift behind a person's eyes. "She lives with her mother in another state," he added calmly. The twins accepted the answer without judgment, as children often do, and returned their attention to the warm air rising from the vent like invisible waves. Outside the window the night had settled fully over Cedar Ridge, the dark sky scattered with clear winter stars while the faint glow of porch lights dotted the quiet road beyond the fence line. Daniel lifted his toolbox and stepped toward the door. "If the heater makes noise again, just let me know," he said. Emily followed him onto the porch where the cold air brushed gently against the warmth from inside the house. For a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet countryside stretched around them with only the distant sound of wind moving through the dry fields. "You did not have to do that," Emily said softly. Daniel looked out across the road before answering. "Sometimes small things matter more than people think." Emily studied him for a moment as if trying to understand the quiet philosophy behind those simple words. Before she could say more, the twins suddenly appeared in the doorway behind her. "Thank you for fixing our heater," Lily said earnestly. Ava nodded with serious agreement. Daniel offered a small respectful nod to both girls before stepping down from the porch and walking toward his truck. The gravel shifted beneath his boots while the engine started with a low rumble. As the headlights swept across the small yard, Emily stood beneath the porch light watching the truck pull slowly back onto Maple Road. Inside the house, Lily whispered to her sister while peeking through the window. "He is nice," she said. Ava nodded. "He fixes things." Emily stepped back inside and closed the door gently, feeling the steady warmth of the house settle around them again. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, the silence of the small home did not feel heavy. It felt calm. And somewhere down the quiet road, Daniel Harper drove beneath the dark sky, unaware that the simple evening repair he had completed was quietly beginning to change more than just the temperature inside that small white house. The following morning arrived with a pale gray sky stretching quietly over Cedar Ridge, the kind of winter morning when the air felt thin and the frost along the roadside glittered faintly beneath the rising sun. Inside the small white house on Maple Road, the heater hummed steadily for the first time in weeks, and the warmth inside the living room felt like a quiet victory that no one needed to announce. Lily and Ava sat at the kitchen table finishing bowls of oatmeal, while Emily Carter tied their scarves carefully beneath their coats. The girls seemed lighter somehow, their small voices carrying more energy as they talked about a school reading contest that would start the following week. "The winner gets a big trophy," Ava explained with wide eyes. Lily nodded confidently. "And maybe a book gift card." Emily smiled at their excitement, but her attention drifted briefly toward the kitchen window where the gravel road stretched toward the distant highway. Life had begun to feel slightly steadier, but the quiet uncertainty that followed every new beginning had not completely disappeared. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel Harper stepped out of the carpentry shop with a travel mug of coffee warming his hands while the early sunlight touched the roof of the building. The shop had not opened yet, and the town remained quiet except for the distant sound of a school bus engine somewhere beyond the fields. Mike approached him from the doorway while pulling on his jacket. "I heard you fixed the Carter heater last night," he said with a casual grin. Daniel took a slow sip of coffee. "It was just a loose connection." Mike nodded thoughtfully. "Still, that family has had a rough start since moving here." Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he looked across the empty street where the frost still clung to the grass like a thin blanket. Some stories did not need to be repeated in conversation. A few minutes later, the familiar yellow school bus rolled through Maple Road with its brakes hissing gently as it stopped beside the narrow gravel shoulder. Lily and Ava climbed aboard after hugging their mother goodbye, their backpacks bouncing lightly against their coats while the bus driver waved politely from behind the wheel. Emily stood watching until the bus disappeared down the road as she had done every morning since arriving in Cedar Ridge. The cold air brushed against her cheeks while the quiet farmland stretched in every direction. Then she turned to walk back toward the house. At that exact moment, the deep rumble of a large vehicle echoed faintly across the distant highway. Emily paused near the fence line, her attention drawn toward the sound. It was unusual for heavy traffic to pass through the outskirts of Cedar Ridge this early in the morning. The sound grew louder for a moment before fading again behind the hills. She shook the thought away and stepped back inside the house where the heater continued its steady rhythm. Later that afternoon, Daniel drove through the center of town toward the hardware store, the winter sun already beginning to sink lower behind the rooftops. As he approached the intersection near Cedar Ridge Elementary, he noticed something unusual along the roadside ahead. Two dark SUVs rolled slowly through town, followed by a larger vehicle carrying the emblem of a military veteran support organization along its side panel. The small convoy moved calmly, not with urgency, but with purpose. Several people standing outside the diner turned to watch as the vehicles passed quietly along the street. Daniel slowed his truck slightly as they continued toward the rural roads leading beyond town. He did not yet know where they were heading, But somewhere down Maple Road, Emily Carter stood inside her small house, unaware that before the sun set, that evening something unexpected was already making its way toward her quiet life in Cedar Ridge. The afternoon sun hung low over Cedar Ridge when the quiet rumble of engines finally turned off the highway and rolled slowly down Maple Road. The convoy of dark SUVs and the large veteran support vehicle moving carefully along the narrow gravel path that led toward the small white house near the fence line. And inside the house, Emily Carter stood at the kitchen counter sorting through a small stack of unpaid envelopes when the distant sound reached her ears again, louder this time. Unusual. For the peaceful edge of town, where traffic rarely passed except for the school bus and the occasional farm truck. She stepped toward the window and looked out across the yard just as the first SUV turned into the driveway and came to a calm stop beneath the pale winter sky. For a moment, Emily simply stood there, uncertain whether the vehicles had stopped at the wrong address. But then the door of the lead SUV opened, and a man stepped out wearing the uniform of a military support officer, his posture formal yet respectful as he approached the porch. At the same moment, Lily and Ava returned from school on the bus and were walking up the gravel road when they noticed the vehicles parked outside their house, their backpacks bouncing against their coats as they hurried toward the yard with wide, curious eyes. Emily opened the front door slowly as the officer removed his cap and greeted her with a polite nod. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked. Emily straightened slightly. "Yes." The officer held a sealed envelope in his hand and spoke in a steady voice that carried both respect and warmth. "I am here on behalf of the National Veterans Support Foundation and the United States Military Families Assistance Program." Emily blinked in quiet confusion. "Is something wrong?" The officer shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. Actually, this visit is long overdue." Behind him, the other volunteers stepped from the vehicles and began opening the rear doors where several boxes and documents were carefully arranged. Lily and Ava reached the porch just in time to hear the officer continue speaking. "Your husband, Sergeant Michael Carter, filed a long-term assistance request for his family before his final deployment. He arranged for this program to support you and your daughters in case anything ever happened." Emily's breath caught softly as the words settled into the quiet air around the small house. "I never knew," she whispered. The officer nodded with understanding. "The paperwork was delayed during processing, and we only recently completed the review." He handed her the envelope. "Inside you will find confirmation of a housing support grant, full education assistance for your daughters, and the transfer of a veterans family trust your husband established years ago." For a moment, Emily could not speak. The twins looked up at her with wide, hopeful eyes while the volunteers carried boxes toward the porch. Down the road, a familiar pickup truck slowed to a stop as Daniel Harper, returning from town, noticed the unexpected gathering at the Carter house. He stepped out quietly and walked toward the yard just as Emily turned and saw him standing near the gate. The officer followed her gaze. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "your husband left one final note in the trust file." He unfolded a small card and read the words aloud. "Take care of my girls, and thank the good people who stand beside them when I cannot." The quiet yard fell still beneath the fading afternoon light as Emily looked toward Daniel with tears shining gently in her eyes. And in that silent moment, the town of Cedar Ridge seemed to understand that the small acts of kindness that had begun weeks earlier had just grown into something far greater than anyone could have expected.